Hello, we're carrying on today with our thoughts for the weeks after Easter. I hope you're enjoying these video messages while we're unable to physically meet in the church building. We'll carry on doing them for as long as that is the case. And of course, because they're on the internet, anybody can see them and use them if they want to, which is great. So if you think it's helpful, or if you know anybody that you think would find them helpful, can be anybody near or far, friends, neighbours, whatever, do feel free to mention to people that these messages are on the Kempston East Methodist website every week. Today's reading comes from Luke's Gospel, and it's nearly at the end of what Luke told us about the life of Jesus, the meeting between some disciples and some other people and the risen Jesus on the road. Luke chapter 24. That same day, two of them were on their way to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, talking together about all that had happened. As they talked and argued, Jesus himself came up and walked with them, but something prevented them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What is it you are debating as you walk?" They stood still, their faces full of sadness, and one, called Byass, answered, "Are you the only person staying in Jerusalem not to have heard the news of what has happened there in the last few days?" "What news?" he said. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied, "who, by deeds and words of power, proved himself a prophet in the sight of God and the whole people, and how our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. But we had been hoping that he was to be the liberator of Israel. What's more, this is the 3rd day since it happened, and now some women of our company have astounded us. They went early to the tomb, but failed to find his body, and returned with a story that they had seen a vision of angels who told them he was alive. Then some of our people went to the tomb and found things just as the women had said, but him they didn't see." "How dull you are," he answered. "How slow to believe all that the prophets said. Was not the Messiah bound to suffer in this way before entering upon his glory?" Then, starting from Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them in the whole of Scripture the things that referred to himself. By this time they'd reached the village to which they were going, and he made as if to continue his journey. But they pressed him, "Stay with us, for evening approaches and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them, and when he had sat down with them at table, he took bread and said the blessing. He broke the bread and offered it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. They said to one another, "Were not our hearts on fire as he talked with us on the road and explained the Scriptures to us?" Without a moment's delay, they set out and returned to Jerusalem. There they found that the 11 and the rest of the company had assembled, and were saying, "It's true, the Lord has risen. He has appeared to Simon." Then they described what had happened on their journey, and how he had made himself known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is a fascinating story. You have to try and put yourself in the place of the people who had been around Jesus up to the time of his crucifixion. They were amazed by him, captivated, fascinated. And of course, as we all know, when somebody close to us, somebody special dies, it's a huge loss. That's more what we mean by mourning and grief. And so this story, which is only taking place about a week after the disciples had been with Jesus at the Last Supper, this story is coming into that time of grief and mourning when they were desperately thinking, what next? The whole excitement and wonder that they had for Jesus and around the things he'd been doing seemed to have all gone pear-shaped. And so it was curious to these two walking along the road out of Jerusalem to meet somebody who they didn't recognise and who didn't seem to know what the latest news was even. Didn't seem to know what was on people's minds. Of course, at that stage, for whatever reason, Luke makes it very clear that they didn't know that they were talking to Jesus. They didn't recognise him. You can put different interpretations on that. Sometimes when we meet people out of context, even if we know them quite well, because we're not expecting to see them, we don't recognise them. I've done that. I do that. I'm not the best at recognising people anyway, and if people turn up in a place where I'm not expecting to see them and they're somehow not on my radar, it's very easy to suddenly realise that you haven't made a connection that you should have made. So maybe that's what Luke meant when he said they didn't recognise Jesus. On the other hand, of course, we have to accept that Jesus in this story was not alive in a human form in the same way as he had been the week before. I'm not saying here that he wasn't alive, I'm just saying that he wasn't alive in the same human form as he had been before he was killed. So maybe it was understandable that he was not recognisable even to people who knew him quite well. We don't know. We can't say for definite. But it's fascinating to hear that conversation unfolding about how those friends of Jesus explained to somebody who they thought was a stranger, somebody who they discovered didn't know what was going on at the time, or appeared to not know what was going on at the time. They explained to him how wonderful Jesus was. And not only how wonderful he was, but of their dashed hopes for Jesus being or becoming the Messiah, the leader, the solution to the problem. It's very tempting when things aren't going well in whatever spheres we move in, whether it's a country that's not doing well or a community that's not doing well, people start to long for new leadership. And that's very much where some of Jesus' friends were coming from. They hoped and longed, based on what he'd been doing and based on what he'd been saying, that he was the new leader, the leader in waiting. And we kind of see glimpses of that, of course, in the Palm Sunday story as he entered into Jerusalem. But what they didn't understand at that time was that the culmination of that journey into Jerusalem was very different from any hopes of him taking over and sorting everything out and making everything wonderful and harmonious and idyllic and so on. So here are these friends of Jesus feeling bereaved, feeling sad, feeling confused, and trying to square up their ideas of what might happen next and explain those to this supposed stranger that they met. Of course, the Last Supper that had taken place the week before, roughly speaking, was a landmark moment for all of Jesus' disciples and friends and followers. It was, although they didn't exactly know what was going to happen the next day at that point, it was a point in the story that was a defining moment of Jesus taking bread and wine and sharing it with them and telling them that they should do this in remembrance of him. Of course, that would have seemed quite a strange instruction at the time, because, you know, why would somebody be saying you should do this in remembrance of me when he was actually there with them and doing it with them? But of course, after the crucifixion, the poignancy of that Last Supper would have been all too real to all of them. And so it's fascinating in this story that whole week, as it were, from the Last Supper to this walk along the road and staying together in Emmaus, is kind of bookended by Jesus taking bread and breaking it. And clearly that was the moment of revelation for these friends of his. They hadn't recognized who he was when they met him on the road. They hadn't recognized who he was when they were talking to him. They just thought that he was a not very well informed stranger. And yet, when that point came that he took bread and broke it and shared it with them, suddenly the penny dropped. Suddenly they realized that they'd actually spent most of the day walking with Jesus, talking with him. They must have felt a little bit foolish, because how could they have not recognized who he was earlier on? Why did it have to be the breaking of the bread that was that moment of recognition? Well, like many stories, it's easy for us to apply hindsight and say, well, yes, it emphasizes to us the importance of Jesus' living presence in the breaking of bread. And that's why, to this day, what we now call Holy Communion is so important for us and for Christian communities in general. We might have slightly different ways of doing it, and of course at the moment we can't do it at all, but in normal times we have slightly different ways of doing it, but the common factor really is that breaking of bread and sharing, just as Jesus did in the Last Supper. Remembering him, not just remembering him as an historic figure, not just remembering what he did in that original breaking of bread, but, as became so evident for his friends here, remembering him, coming to him again in that moment of breaking bread. And so that kind of set the agenda, as it were, for the centrality of breaking bread, sharing wine in communion. Not because just of the bread and wine itself, but it's that breaking of the bread that reminds us centrally of the presence of the risen Christ with us as we share in that bread. People sometimes say, oh well, not sure that so-and-so should take communion because I don't think they really understand it, or I'm not sure that small children should take communion because I'm not sure that they really understand it. Well, I'm quite happy to put my hand up as one of the people that don't quite understand it. I mean, if you look objectively, you say, well, why is it so important to share bread and wine in order to remember the presence of Jesus? And yet, at another level, we say, yes, it is really important. Just as important as it was actually for these two people to not realize that Jesus was present until that point came where he broke the bread and shared it, and they instantly recognized that this guy they'd been talking with was in fact the risen Jesus. So I hope that's some helpful thinking. Maybe some thinking that we can hold and remember when we are able to come back into our church building and sharing communion again. It's going to be a little while, I'm afraid, before we can do that, but I'm sure it's something that we all look forward to and anticipate, remembering that presence of Christ that we will rediscover in the breaking of that communion bread when we are able to do so. Clearly, this story that we've been thinking about today was important to Charles Wesley, because he wrote a communion hymn that's very closely linked to that reading that we heard and some of the thoughts that I've been sharing. I'm definitely not about to sing it to you, but I will read it. It's nice poetic language, you might say slightly old-fashioned language, but that's okay. That's the language that goes with the time of Charles Wesley. O thou who this mysterious bread didst in Emmaus break, return herewith our souls to feed, and to thy followers speak. Unseal the volume of thy grace, apply the gospel word. Open our eyes to see thy face, our hearts to know the Lord. Of thee communing still, we mourn till thou the veil remove. Talk with us, and our hearts shall burn with flames of fervent love. Enkindle now the heavenly zeal, and make thy mercy known, and give our pardoned souls to feel that God and love are one. I'm sure that many of you, like me, are enjoying the nice spring weather that we're having these days and seeing things change, flowers coming out and signs of spring and new life. As you know, on these videos we've been following the story of the blue tits that are nesting in my shed. And I'm pleased to say that there is progress. There are more eggs now than we had last week, and it seems fairly clear that the incubation has started. That's just the last day or two, and they take about 2 weeks to hatch, so we'll follow them and see what happens. We can't tell exactly what the outcome will be by any means, but so far things are looking good, and that's an exciting bit of new life to accompany our thinking through this Easter season. We also have a couple of sad things to reflect on just at the moment. On Tuesday we will have Roger's funeral, and we think of his family and all of those who counted him as a good friend, whom we miss. And we've just heard as well that Maisie has died. A lovely lady who meant so much to so many people. So we think of her family and her friends as well at this sad time.